This video is going to be covering, in a short version, Milgram's famous study into obedience. It's specifically done for the OCR psychology course, but of course is relevant to anybody interested in psychology. It's certainly one of the most famous studies in psychology. The background to the study is the Second World War. Milgram was interested in whether the Holocaust could happen again, and that links to the aim of the study, the so-called germs of different hypothesis. One suggestion at the time was that the reason why the Holocaust happened is because some element of the German population are different to other human beings. The implication being that they're maybe somewhat psychopathic or certainly very dangerous and can carry out terrible crimes against humanity. Um, Milgram wanted to test that out because he suspected that that wasn't the case, that there was not so much personality disorders going on in the German population, but rather a set of historically maybe quite unique situations which led to people following orders which they would never normally have followed. But he wanted to test that out empirically, and that's why he designed this study. Let's then have a look at the method that he used to do this. Now, in some textbooks, you'll hear that this study is referred to as a laboratory experiment. And that is correct because Milgram does a series of experiments, a series of studies which become experiments after this initial study. And he ends up studying hundreds of participants. But if you're doing the OCR psychology course, this study is a standalone, and you don't really need to reference any other work that he's done. It's good to know it, but you're certainly not going to be asked about it. So in which case, this study on its own, the first study that he published in obedience, really is a controlled observation. And the reason for that is there's no IV in this study. If there's no IV, then there's no experiment. It's not an experimental method. It is very tightly controlled, and he does observe human behavior. Therefore, it's a controlled observation. The sample was 40 male participants. You can read up on your textbook or watch one of my other more detailed videos on this to see how he got those participants. The only thing I'll note here is that they were all male participants, and the main reason for that is he was trying to replicate, when I say wartime conditions, it was male soldiers that were following these terrible orders to kill people. And he wanted to replicate that. He didn't want to test whether women would follow those orders. He did do that in subsequent research, but for this study, male participants. The main piece of apparatus that you need to be aware of is the shock generator that he developed. It looked real. It sounded real. The idea is that you go up the shock generator in 15-volt increments, giving people electric shocks. Now, there was no real electric shocks given, but the machinery led you to believe that that was the case. Now, in terms of the procedure, there's quite a bit of detail to this, which really you should know. But for this video, the essence that you need to know is that the participant would be given the role of a teacher, and he would go into the room and see a learner. Now, that learner was not a participant. That learner was what we call a confederate, somebody who's part of the study and they know what's going on. They would watch this, in this case, it was a man being wired up to the shock generator. The teacher then would go into an adjoining room. They would ask questions to the learner. If the learner got the question wrong, gave a wrong answer, a voltage would be applied. So they would flick a switch. It would start off at 15 volts. And the next time the learner got a question wrong, it would go up to 30 volts. And it would continue that way in 15-volt increments, all the way up to a potentially massive maximum of 450 volts. So there's a lot more to it than that, but that's the essence that you want to be familiar with. Now, the question we've got, of course, is how far would people go? So let's have a look at the results. In terms of the quantitative data, so that's the numerical data, 26 out of the 40 participants went all the way up to the 450-volt mark. So that's the take-home message. That's the bit you want to remember. It's approximately 65%. Um, Everybody, all 40 participants, went up to the 300-volt mark. And so around the 300-volt mark that the learner has been protesting, okay, against this treatment. They don't like receiving such large electric shocks. But at the 300-volt level, the learner goes quiet. The idea is that maybe he's passed out, gone unconscious, something like that. So the question again is, will they keep going even though the person's not responding? And as the data showed, 26 out of the 40 did. The others dropped out somewhere between the 300-volt up to 450-volt shock. Now, in terms of the qualitative data, so that's the non-numerical data. So that's data that in this case was recorded by watching their behavior in particular, and also some of what they said. The participants are often showing resistance. They don't want to comply. They don't want to obey. They're stressed, quite clearly, a lot of sweating, nervous laughter. So it's clear that the majority of participants didn't want to obey, but did. And that's the sort of take-home message. It's not that they are not showing any resistance at all. They know that this is wrong, but they still continue. So let's have a look at the conclusions. So always remember, conclusions is what you can sum up from the results. A good way for students to remember this when asked in an exam to write a conclusion is to start your answer with the words, "The results suggest that." Okay, so just repeat that. So if you're ever asked to conclude or make a conclusion from a study in psychology, you want to start your answer with the results or this, the results suggest that, and whatever you write next should be a conclusion. So the results suggest that, let's take the middle one on the screen, that situational variables are more important in terms of shaping human behavior, at least in regards to obedience, than any individual variables. What does that mean? It means that your personality, that's an individual variable, is not really very important, according to this data, as to whether you'd be obedient or not. What is the nature of the situation you find yourself in that will lead you to being more or less obedient. Now, another conclusion is that he didn't support his hypothesis. It would, from the data, suggest that Germans probably aren't really very different to any other human being, that what most likely happened, again, to go back to the background and the aim of the study, is that during the Holocaust, these men were put in intolerable situations, which they probably knew on some level were really wrong, but still complied with the orders, went along with them. This is, by the way, not to excuse that behavior. Always remember, in psychology, we are explaining behavior, all right? Not justifying it. So in this case, Milgram is not letting the Germans off the hook or anything like that. He's just trying to explain, or attempt to explain experimentally, why such terrible crimes against humanity may have happened. And of course, the main conclusion, and this was a big one for Milgram, is participants were, of course, surprisingly obedient. Nobody expected this. Milgram himself didn't really expect this level of obedience. And if you go into some more detail in this study, you will find out that he'd asked students and other researchers whether they thought how far they would go in this experimental setup. And pretty much everyone said, well, they're not going to go very far because people it's wrong and people know it's going to be wrong and they'll stop. Turns out that's not true. So just to sum up and finish, one of the main reasons why this study is so famous is not just because it's about shocks and it's a very memorable study. That is true. It's because it shows empirically, meaning we can put a number on it, all right? We can test it and we can retest it and show this to be true to a large extent, that people are far more obedient than we ever think they're going to be. And that the most important factors that seem to shape obedient behavior is the nature of the situation you find yourself in. To understand why specifically they were very obedient in Milgram's study, you probably want to dig a bit deeper, go a bit deeper into the study to see what the setup was like and the kind of factors, the pressure that they were put under that would encourage somebody to be obedient. But before you do that, you have to understand the essentials. And I'm hoping for you that this video has covered the essentials and that you can take your studies a little bit further.